So another record here in gold, $2,761, even as the chart flickers in front of me here on CNBC, now $2,761.20. It is continuing to climb a week before the U.S. election, one of the main reasons given for this continued move higher in gold prices. Now, I mentioned last week, we went through all of the reasons in the world, as I like to call them, for why gold was moving higher. And interestingly, we have another one. And hello and welcome to the Northern Miner Podcast. My name's Adrian Pocobelli. And we have another reason that is being given, courtesy of Mohamed Al-Arian. You know, I'd say a fairly credible individual, has been on financial media for, years and years. A bond market guy, from what I understand. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Al-Arian says soaring gold is driven by dollar diversification. And for all the reasons we heard last week, whether it was angst around the U.S. election, whether it was geopolitical tensions in the Middle East, whether it was an easing central bank, whether it was central bank gold buying, whether it was a growing economy in the U.S., whether it was a declining economy in the U.S., all those reasons given, Al-Arian has another one. And quite an interesting one, too, especially in the context of the BRICS summit, which we're going to get to. I mentioned it in passing last week, but there were a couple of significant news stories that do impact us, particularly on the precious metals front. But let's start with Mohamed Al-Arian. There are a couple of quotes here in this Bloomberg article, which I want to jump to. And here they are. Quote, "When we try to relate the moves in gold this year to traditional financial and economic variables, interest rates, the dollar, the relationships have broken down," end quote, said Al-Arian, the president of Queen's College, Cambridge, on Bloomberg Television Friday. The secular move can be attributed to two fundamental drivers, he added. Quote, "One is the slow diversification away from the dollar and the reserves of central banks around the world. The other is a slow diversification away from the dollar payment system," end quote. While the move has been slow, quote, "the bad news is the momentum is building up," end quote, said Al-Arian, who is also a Bloomberg opinion columnist. Recent events have accelerated the trend towards gold, according to Al-Arian. Chief among them is Russia's ability to maintain trading relationships and grow even after the exclusion of its major banks from SWIFT, a global financial messaging service. While recent SWIFT data shows that the share of dollars in international payments has held relatively stable in recent years, just below 50%, and far exceeding other currencies, transactions involving the yuan have risen in recent months. The other event is the Middle East, Al-Arian said, adding that a majority of countries have viewed U.S. as an, quote, "inconsistent backer," end quote, of human rights and international law. So another reason from Mohamed Al-Arian to add to our laundry list of reasons as to why gold is going up. Now, over to BRICS here, we did get something. I mean, because there's so much discussion of BRICS in the gold bug community, I almost bring it up with a certain degree of reservation because I feel like it's just sometimes gets overplayed, so to speak. But we have a pretty significant headline here, and this is Reuters. Russia in talks with BRICS over precious metals exchange. And it really dovetails into our whole discussion of the LME and the Shanghai Futures Exchange, who are going to collaborate now. The LME sounds like they're very excited to share their century of innovation with the Shanghai Futures Exchange. And of course, the LME, as I've mentioned several times, owned by Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing. And what you're going to see here in this article is, again, a move towards gaining control over pricing. And in this case, it's with precious metals. This is from October 24th. This is Reuters. Russia is in talks with other BRICS members about creating an international precious metals exchange to ensure fair pricing and trade growth, the country's finance minister, Anton Siluanov, said in a statement on Thursday. Leaders of BRIC countries, which account for 37% of the global economy, gathered in the Russian city of Kazan this week to discuss initiatives aimed at creating alternatives to the Western-dominated financial and trade infrastructure. To Mohamed Al-Arian's point, and we have a quote from Siluanov, quote, "The mechanism will include the creation of price indicators for metals, standards for the production and trade of bullion, and instruments for accrediting market participants, clearing, and auditing within BRICS," end quote. the BRICS Precious Metals Exchange would rival Western trading platforms such as the London Metal Exchange and would protect trade from sanctions imposed by the West on BRICS members Russia and Iran. So, quite an interesting development there, and you see another push towards gaining control of pricing over metals, in this case, precious metals, and that is from Reuters. Now, finally, on the whole gold front, we have a breakout in the gold stocks, a long-awaited breakout, and if you want to read all the details about it, go to mining.com. You'll find a very in-depth analysis from Adam Hamilton of Zeal Intelligence posting, again, a very detailed analysis of the price action in gold and gold stocks. And the title of the article is called Gold Stocks Secular Breakout. And indeed, when you look at GDX, the Van Eck Gold Miners ETF on Google Finance here, you'll see on August 7th, 2020, we hit $42.74. And then here we are, just on October 18th, we hit $43.15. Now, I'm not sure if that confirmed, interestingly. You know, I think Gareth Soloway, the technical analyst who we've had a few times on the show here in the past, and it actually looks like a bit of a double top, and it doesn't look like it confirmed. We're back below that previous high, interestingly. Adam Hamilton is calling it a breakout, though, and it may have stayed up there. So definitely check that out on mining.com. Now, bringing us to the geopolitical stage, we have a very interesting story here. We've paid a lot of attention to Africa in the last year. This is interesting out of Myanmar. Rebels take control of Myanmar rare earth mining hub. And I looked at that headline by staff at mining.com, and I looked at the map, and I started doing some research, and it's quite an interesting country. It's surprisingly large, considering how little you hear of Myanmar, and just even the name itself, the U.S. State Department, they call it Burma. And apparently, the name was changed from Burma to Myanmar by a government, I believe, in the last 30 years, because of associations with British colonialism and Burma. And also the reason being given in a short history I watched on a YouTube video is because there are more than Burmese people in Burma, and there's a sense that it didn't really recognize all of the different groups that live in this fairly large country with a fairly large border, I have to say, with China. Quite interesting if you take a look at the map. Now, let's return to this story on Myanmar and rare earths. The Kachin Independence Army, or KIA, which has been fighting Myanmar's military junta in power since 2021 on Wednesday, said it had taken control of the country's rare earth mining region. Rare earth mining in Myanmar is concentrated in Kachin State around the towns of Panhua and Chipway, adjacent to southwestern China's Yunnan province. The region also hosts a number of gem mining sites and is a key trade route into Myitkyina, Kachin state capital, and north into China. And I believe it says there's also a deep water port. So the more you learn about this, the more you see how important Myanmar is. And I'm going to call it Myanmar because Google Maps has Myanmar and then it has Burma in parentheses. So I'll go with Myanmar based on Google Maps. A Kia spokesman told Reuters on Tuesday the group wrested control of the areas from the militia group NDAK over the weekend, but did not elaborate on its plans on mining in the region. The NDAK is allied with the ruling junta and has been working with Chinese companies involved in mining. And so I did a little research, and what you'll find is China is backing the military junta and the U.S. is backing the rebels, interestingly. And again, to read the headline, rebels take control of Myanmar rare earth mining hub. And just a few more lines on this, it's quite remarkable. In a note on Tuesday, Animus Intelligence, a Toronto-based rare earth and battery metals research consultancy, said rebel control of these mining sites could potentially disrupt rare earth concentrate shipments into China, which have declined for 4 months straight owing to the monsoon season and other challenges. Adamus says, with Myanmar responsible for 57% of global dysprosium and terbium mine supply last year, A prolonged disruption would strain availability of feedstock supplies for magnet makers during what is typically a seasonally strong quarter. So, Myanmar is responsible for 57% of global dysprosium and terbium mine supply. Quite interesting. More than 90% of electric vehicles feature at least one permanent magnet motor, and rising production from Myanmar and low prices have made it easy for automakers, quote, to turn a blind eye to the environmental destruction and social upheaval that rare earth mining fuels in the country, end quote, according to Adamus. And I was watching another documentary on YouTube on rare earths, and it sounds like China has moved a significant amount of their rare earth mining to countries such as Myanmar, where they do part of the dirty work of extracting the rare earths, and then they get sent to China to process. And here is a final quote from Adamus. Quote, should the recent border seizure and expected capture of rare earth mines this week result in a disruption of rare earth concentrate flows to China from Myanmar, importers of Chinese rare earths and magnets may soon have to pay, literally and figuratively, for failing to support and secure alternative sources of supply in time, end quote. So another interesting geopolitical flashpoint that you hardly hear about. And the only reason it was brought to my attention is because, there's a rare earth metals hub that was just taken over. And so here's another headline here from Voice of America on Myanmar. According to Myanmar's opposition, dialogue is impossible and China must rethink junta support. And I believe it's here that we hear about the deepwater port. Indeed, scrolling down the article, China's strategic interest in Myanmar is securing infrastructure projects like the Sino-Myanmar pipeline, which links Myanmar's deepwater port of Kyaukphyu in the western part of the country in the Bay of Bengal with Kunming in Yunnan, an inland province in southwestern China. The Chinese state media outlet Global Times reported in 2023 that approximately 52 billion cubic meters of natural gas have been transported through the Sino-Myanmar pipeline since it began operation on July 28, 2013, reaching its intended transmission capacity. And as Jason Tower, Burma Program Director at U.S. Institute of Peace, so again, in this article, it being referred to as Burma, as Jason Tower said, quote, China's geostrategic investments are already in the crossfire, end quote. So an interesting flashpoint here in Myanmar, with a not insignificant amount of the rare earths that are being supplied to China potentially being cut off, which changes the game. So just finally on Myanmar, there's an article from back in August 16th, so a little over 2 months ago, U.S. meets Myanmar opposition, pledges expanded support. So that was in August, and that was Reuters. So a lot going on under the radar, indeed, in Myanmar. Now, another interesting situation with natural resources on China's border is happening with Afghanistan, and here's a Reuters article via mining.com. China to offer Taliban tariff-free trade as it inches closer to isolated resource-rich regime. Now, I did a search, and there is a shared border. It's very small between Afghanistan and China. It's about 90 kilometers, so keep that in mind as well. China's quite huge. Here's the article. China will offer the Taliban tariff-free access to its vast construction, energy, and consumer sectors, Beijing's envoy to Afghanistan said on Thursday, as the ailing resource-rich but diplomatically isolated regime looks to build up its markets. Beijing has sought to develop its ties with the Taliban since they took control of Afghanistan in 2021, but like all governments, has refrained from formally recognizing the Islamic fundamentalist group's rule amid international concern over its human rights record and those of women and girls. And scrolling down the article a bit, we have a quote from Zhao Jing, Chinese ambassador to Afghanistan, who wrote on his official X account late on Thursday, quote, China will offer Afghanistan zero tariff treatment for 100% tariff lines, end quote. It almost sounds like a free trade deal, but without calling it a free trade deal, I mean, if you have zero tariffs, it sounds like they're just opening the market up. I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying it here, but it's quite interesting. And scrolling down a bit, Afghanistan exported no commodities to China last year, the data shows, but Zhao has regularly posted photos of him meeting Taliban officials responsible for mining, petroleum, trade, and regional connectivity since his appointment last September. And of course, when you think of this in the context of Myanmar, it does raise a question, and who knows if it's true, but it does raise a question on whether China is diversifying, their source of rare earths, potentially as a move in the long term. Afghanistan is supposed to have a huge amount of rare earths. You do a search on Afghanistan and rare earths, you get a CNN article that appears, the Taliban are sitting on $1 trillion worth of minerals. Another article shows up, Afghanistan's rare earth element bonanza. So perhaps China is eyeing Afghanistan's rare earths as a kind of hedge against problems in Myanmar. One wonders. And finally, on Afghanistan, the FT they call it a visual investigation, how the Taliban took over Afghanistan's mines. And it really shows how important mining is for the Taliban in Afghanistan, and just the importance that these minerals have to the government there from an economic point of view. So very interesting there. Now, bringing us to Africa, to the Eastern DRC, we do have a significant headline. This is from DefenseWeb. Rwandan-backed M23 rebel group seeks local power in DRC, not just control over mining operations. And I saw a few headlines on this. They want political control, not just control over the resources. And it's quite interesting what DefenseWeb says here. It says M23's disruptive strategy aims to replace Congolese authorities and overhaul local governance in areas it controls in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Key to the strategy is undermining and replacing local authorities, taking over strategic trade routes, and the installation of an elaborate taxation regime. That does sound like governance, doesn't it? These strategies also allow M23 and Rwanda to generate revenues from the local economy, including rents from the DRC's mineral wealth, without necessarily directly controlling mines. So the M23 continue to, push forward their agenda, which is still kind of unclear, other than taking over this land where there are natural resources and now seemingly wanting to tax it as if it's their own, little fiefdom. Finally, on this story, we have a story from the Associated Press. Congo wants UN peacekeepers gone, but endless war around minerals is complicating that. And that is the headline. And basically, there are UN peacekeepers in the Eastern DRC, and they haven't really been getting the job done, have they? The locals are annoyed with them. And there was an agreement that they would be leaving by December, but now they're saying the war is complicating that. And as it says here, halfway down the article, you can see that MONUSCO, which is the UN force that is in the Eastern DRC, quote, you can see MONUSCO is there, but that's in name only. People are dying, but it does nothing, end quote, said Maombi Aline, a displaced person in Goma. And finally, just to illustrate how complicated this Eastern DRC story is, Goma, which is a city in the Eastern DRC, Goma's streets are full of armed men, local and foreign. In addition to the UN force and an unknown number of Congolese forces, there are about 1,000 foreign mercenaries, a coalition of local militia, and a Southern African regional force. A recently deployed East African force was kicked out amid criticism it was ineffective. Quote, it's a military jungle, end quote, said Onesfor Sematumba, a Congolese researcher for the International Crisis Group. Quote, there are many actors, but everyone has their own agenda. They can't make a difference because they are divided, end quote. Global interest in Eastern Congo's minerals is one of the reasons the violence is so difficult to be contained, experts said. And finally, Joe Biden's trip to Angola has been scheduled for the first week of December 2024 to celebrate the Libido Corridor project as a major victory for the United States in the competition for economic control of Africa. And that is from a story by Danielle Volman at Eurasia Review. So it continues over here at the Northern Miner, another wild week in the natural resources sector. And coming up on this week's show, we have Women in Mining Canada Vice Chair Jennifer Cameron. So a super interesting interview. What is happening with women in mining? Where are we? What needs to be fixed? What is going well? What are people saying at these meetings and everything? So a great interview with Jennifer Cameron coming up, again, Vice Chair of Women in Mining Canada. If you want to find us online, you can find us at northernminer.com. You can find us on X at Northern Miner. You can find us on Instagram at The Northern Miner, and on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where we also host these podcasts. And wherever podcasts are available, including Spotify, SoundCloud, and Apple Podcasts. And with that, let's turn to the news. And turning to the website, a big story on mining.com, Astroforge secures first ever commercial license for asteroid mission. Another whole theme that I expect will really start to pick up later this decade. Astroforge, a U.S.-based startup with plans to mine asteroids, received on Monday the U.S. Federal Communications Commission's first ever commercial license to operate in deep space. The move sets a precedent for future private sector missions beyond Earth's orbit, as it gives Astroforge both approval for their upcoming mission, Odin, and the green light to establish communications networks with their ground partners. The Odin mission, to be launched in January 2025, so not that long from now, is part of the firm's ambitious plan to harvest precious metals from asteroids, offering an alternative to Earth's dwindling critical resources. This is not the first launch for the company. In April 2023, Astroforge launched a small CubeSat called Brocker 1 on a SpaceX transporter flight, but was unable to transmit the necessary commands to demonstrate its space-based minerals and metals refining technology. The company also ran into issues when preparing a second mission, originally called Brocker 2, and which is now ready to be launched. A third attempt is planned for late 2025, when the company will launch Vestri. This craft is about twice the size of Odin and is designed to return to the targeted metallic asteroid and dock with it by using magnets, as it is expected the asteroid will be rich in iron. If successful, Astroforge plans to send a fourth mission, which will focus on extracting and refining asteroids' metals before returning to Earth. And finally, the Huntington Beach, California-based company is the most advanced private asteroid miner to date. Two previous companies, Planetary Resources and Deep Space Industries, emerged about a decade ago, but neither company arrived on any asteroids and were eventually acquired and rerouted to other endeavors. So now Astroforge is taking the banner of space mining. Continuing on, U.S. Treasury allows miners to access clean energy manufacturing subsidy. This is Reuters via mining.com. The U.S. Treasury Department said on Thursday it would allow some mining companies to access a tax credit aimed at boosting American production of solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, and other clean energy components, a shift in position after industry pressure. So mining companies will be able to access a clean energy tax credit. The move reflects the growing realization in Washington that efforts to combat climate change will be moot unless the U.S. boosts its production of lithium, cobalt, and other critical minerals and curbs reliance on China and other overseas rivals. You know, we've been discussing this. The public consciousness on mining is evolving. Washington last December issued proposed rules for manufacturers to access the so-called 45X tax credit created by President Joe Biden's 2022 climate change law, the Inflation Reduction Act, which offers a 10% production credit for U.S.-made products. Those draft rules excluded raw materials from the production costs in favor of processing. For example, the mining of lithium would not have received the credit, but the processing of lithium into a form usable to build a battery would. The mining industry cried foul, noting that processing is impossible without first extracting a mineral. Citing, quote, feedback from stakeholders, end quote, the Treasury Department on Thursday reversed itself, saying that the, quote, material costs and extraction costs, end quote, would be eligible for the tax credit under the final 45X rules, quote, provided certain conditions are met, end quote. Quote, the Biden-Harris administration understands how important onshoring the production of critical minerals is to developing secure, clean energy supply chains, end quote. Wally Adeyemo, the Deputy Treasury Secretary, told reporters on a call. Quote, this will not only help incentivize additional mining, but will mean that mining that already exists is more profitable and they can make greater investments in those mines, end quote. Now, interestingly, the final rules stipulate that the credit can only be obtained once a, quote, eligible component, end quote, is created, essentially favoring mining companies that own processing facilities. The mining would have to take place in the United States, officials said. quote, "The action of extraction alone does not produce an eligible component," end quote, the Treasury Department said in the final rule, which ran to 177 pages. Finally, this may help Sibanye-Stillwater, which mines and processes palladium in Montana and had pushed for the 45X expansion to offset cutthroat Russian competition. But several proposed U.S. nickel mines, for example, would not be eligible because the U.S. does not yet have a nickel smelter. Ali Zaidi, the White House National Climate Advisor, said, quote, "This is absolutely a game changer for our ability to lean into mineral security," end quote. And finally, Rich Nolan, CEO of the National Mining Association, responded saying, quote, "Treasury's decision to limit the credit to those producers who also refine materials will prevent many important projects from benefiting from the credit as Congress intended," end quote. And it's hard not to sympathize with what Rich Nolan is saying. You know, if you're producing the metal, but you need a processing plant in order to get the credit, it seems like almost arbitrary, to be frank. At the end of the day, you need both. The whole point of expanding Who Gets It was because we need the metals as well as the processing. To Rich Nolan's point. Continuing on, U.S. asked G7 to consider sanctions on Russian palladium and titanium. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. The U.S. asked Group of 7 allies to consider sanctions on Russian palladium and titanium. A person familiar with the matter said as the Biden administration mulls fresh ways to squeeze President Vladimir Putin's war machine. Biden administration officials floated the possibility during a meeting of G7 deputy finance ministers on Tuesday in Washington, according to the person who asked not to be identified discussing a private discussion. Finance officials from around the world have gathered in the U.S. Capitol for annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Now, we have another story on palladium coming up, because it sounds like it shot up on that report, as we're going to see in metal prices. Continuing on, Biden administration approves Ioneer's Nevada lithium mine. This is Reuters via mining.com. The U.S. Interior Department on Thursday gave final approval to Ioneer's Rhyolite Ridge lithium mine in Nevada, the first domestic source of the battery metal to be permitted by President Joe Biden's administration, and one that will become a key supplier to Ford and other electric vehicle manufacturers. Shares of the Australia-based critical minerals miner jumped more than 20% in New York trading on Thursday afternoon before easing down. So, a permit given to Ioneer, and another interesting story out of the U.S., this is Reuters via mining.com, U.S. Energy Department finalizes $2.26 billion loan for Lithium Americas Nevada mine. The U.S. Department of Energy finalized a $2.26 billion loan for Lithium Americas on Monday to build Nevada's Thacker Pass lithium mine, one of Washington's largest mining industry investments and part of a broader push to boost critical minerals production. The loan, provisionally approved in March, is a key part of U.S. President Joe Biden's effort to reduce dependence on lithium supplies from China, the world's largest processor of electric vehicle battery metal. Biden officials permitted a similar lithium project under development by Ioneer last week. The Thacker Pass project is slated to open later this decade and be a key supplier to General Motors, which earlier this month boosted its investment in the mine to nearly $1 billion. And we have a quote from Ali Zaidi, the White House National Climate Advisor. Quote, "The Biden-Harris administration recognizes mineral security is essential to winning the global clean energy race," end quote. So a lot of action in the United States on mining. Continuing on, Turkey eyes Niger mining projects amid competition for uranium. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com, and there have been stories of how Turkey has its eyes on Niger's uranium, so we have another one. And this is from Bloomberg News via mining.com. Turkey and Niger signed a provisional pact to boost cooperation in mining, a sign of closer ties between the countries as new powers jostle for access to the West African nation's uranium resources. The agreement, following a visit by a Nigerian delegation to Turkey, aims to help Turkish companies undertake exploration in Niger. Turkish Energy Minister Alparslan Bayraktar wrote on X without elaborating on the nature of potential projects. And so this is all in theory to seek sources of uranium for the country's nascent nuclear power industry, is the rationale that is being given. Continuing on, Australia risks losing top spot in global steel supply chain, Fortescue says. This is Reuters via mining.com. Australia risks losing its dominant position in the global iron ore market if it does not move swiftly to produce green iron, and would do well to learn lessons from the near wipeout of its nickel industry, Fortescue CEO Dino Otranto said on Tuesday. Australia is the world's biggest supplier of seaborne iron ore, accounting for around half of global supply. But the Pilbara grades dug up from the country's west are generally regarded as too low to be turned into steel without using coal. That means that as steelmakers decarbonize by reducing coal use, they are turning elsewhere for iron ore, which could hit Australia's top export earner following the pain suffered in its nickel industry, Otranto told the IMARC conference in Sydney. Competition is revving up on growing investment in green steel projects in the Middle East that are not using Australian iron ore, while Guinea's giant Simandou iron ore mine is set to start up next year, he said. And here is another quote from Otranto. "My warning is look at just what's happening. Let's not sit here with our head in the sand thinking it's not going to happen again." So, waving a red flag on iron ore in Australia and the need to create green iron ore. Very interesting. Just a few headlines here. Electra Battery secures $5 million financing for cobalt refinery early works. And of course, that is in Ontario. And this is by a staff writer at mining.com. And just a snippet, Electra is currently looking to build a low-carbon hydrometallurgical cobalt refining complex in Temiskaming Shores, Ontario. Once complete, it would be the first facility of its kind in North America. The project is expected to cost around $250 million. Continuing on, another big story out of West Africa. Mali threatens to let Barrick mine permit lapse over dispute. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Mali's military government has threatened to take back Barrick Gold's Loulo mine concession when the current permit expires in 2026, amid an escalating dispute over how to divide the economic benefits from operations in the country. Mali is considering letting the permit for Loulo lapse when it expires in February 2026, Finance Minister Aluseni Sanu said in an October 18th letter sent to Barrick's Chief Executive Officer Mark Bristow and seen by Bloomberg. Mali, quote, reserves the right not to renew the operating permit, end quote, and invited Barrick to talk on the mine's, quote, transition phase, end quote, starting later this month, Sanu wrote. You know, what a year it's been for this mine. We had the rumors earlier this year that it was Wagner that wanted to appropriate this mine. Then we've gotten the 4 arrested employees that were released a few weeks ago. And now warnings that the mining license will not be renewed. The move comes as the junta has taken an increasingly hard line against the world's second biggest gold miner, including briefly jailing 4 of its local executives last month over alleged financial crimes. Mali this week accused Barrick of failing to honor a September agreement aimed at resolving their disputes, which the Canadian company has denied. A spokesman for Barrick declined to comment when reached by phone. Mali's finance minister Sanu declined to comment in a text message. The Loulo concession forms part of the Loulo-Gounkoto complex in which Barrick owns 80% and the government holds the rest. And get this. The country last week rejected Barrick's proposal to divide the economic benefits from Loulo-Gounkoto 55% for Mali and 45% for the company. So they rejected that. It seems like a pretty nice deal. So it continues over in Mali. Continuing on, First Quantum confirms talks over Zambian assets. So we were hearing last week that Saudi Arabia was interested in First Quantum's Zambian copper and nickel assets. And so this has been confirmed, although no details were given on the negotiations. So interesting development there. And another headline, Vale and Jinan invest $627 million in iron ore plant in Oman. So another move that we see in the Middle East towards getting involved in metals. And finally, just a few metals headlines as we move towards metals prices here. Panic grows in aluminum market as prices spike toward a record. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. The key raw material needed to make aluminum is tearing towards a record high as buyers race to secure supplies following an export disruption in top miner Guinea that has rippled through to China. Prices for alumina have surged by more than 20% so far this month and are now within striking distance of the record of $707.75 set in 2018 according to pricing agency Fast Markets. And here's a quote from Duncan Hobbs, head of research at metals trading house Concord Resources, who said by phone, quote, "For months, the market has been one accident or event away from a major price move. The Guinea situation has provided the catalyst for another step up in prices, and it sets the stage for a tighter market and a deeper deficit." End quote. Not a dissimilar story to what we're seeing in Mali here. Concerns about Guinea's dominance in bauxite rose to the fore during a coup in 2021. Since then, the nation's ruling military junta has sought to leverage its mineral wealth by compelling miners to invest in alumina plants in-country as well. Quote, "The export ban is likely to be somewhat of a shakedown of mining companies to both increase royalties on bauxite and to accelerate investment in promised alumina refineries in Guinea," and quote, BMO Capital Markets analysts Colin Hamilton and George Heppel said in an emailed note. So interesting that they would use the word panic in the headline with alumina, not a common thing to do. Another metal story, palladium price jumps after U.S. suggests sanctions on Russian exports. So that report leaking and prices responding. Another headline, sanctions delay to Russian zinc mines cause supply miscalculations. And this story by Reuters, which can be found on mining.com, the equipment that is needed for this Russian zinc mine called Ozernoye, they are struggling to produce zinc because they can't get the equipment they need because of sanctions, interestingly. So, interesting headline, supply miscalculation. And this is affecting the zinc price. Another headline, zinc price surges on LME as tech smelter setback adds to supply angst. So, it just goes to show, like, mining is a real-world business, which means accidents are going to happen all the time and things don't work out 100% as planned. Another headline, Korea Zinc attempts to fend off takeover with $1.5 billion share buyback. And another story in a similar vein, Teck Resources cuts copper production forecast again. This is Reuters via mining.com. And the reason being given for cutting production forecasts is labor issues and mining delays at the Highland Valley Copper Mine in Canada. So interesting there. And finally, BHP, Vale, and Samarco reached $30 billion Fundão Dam settlement. That's by Bruno Venditti at mining.com. So they have finally signed the deal with President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in attendance for $30 billion for the Samarco tailings dam disaster in 2015. A huge amount of money. Of course, it's killed 19 people and polluted hundreds of miles of rivers. So a major catastrophe. I remember the reporting we had on it, almost 10 years ago now. So those are your news stories. Now, let's take a look at metal prices. And turning to metal prices, let's take a quick look at the bond market for context. The U.S. 10-year bond is yielding 4.3%. That is 0.09% higher than last week. The UK 10-year gilt is yielding 4.28%. That is 0.09% higher than last week. So UK and US 10-year yields continue to rise. The Italy 10-year bond is yielding 3.53%. That is down 0.03%. from last week, and the German 10-year Bund is unchanged at 2.32%, and the Japanese 10-year bond is yielding 0.99%. That is 0.02% higher than last week, so slightly higher on the week. Turning to precious metals, gold is trading at $2,763.30 per ounce. That is $17 higher than last week and hitting a new record there. Silver is trading at $34.26 per ounce. That is 10 cents lower than last week. Platinum is trading at $1,036.60 per ounce. That is $33 higher than last week. And palladium really making a move on that G7 report at $1,214 even per ounce. That is $159 higher than last week. So palladium really jumping there. Turning to industrial metals, copper is trading at $4.33 per pound. That is a penny higher than last week. Iron ore is slightly lower at $104.23 per metric ton. That is $1 lower than last week. Aluminum is slightly higher at $1.20 per pound. That is 2 cents higher than last week. Lead is slightly lower at 92 cents per pound. That is a penny lower than last week. Nickel is trading at $7.26 per pound. That is 30 cents lower than last week. And tin is also lower at $14.02 per pound. That is 18 cents lower than last week. Cobalt is unchanged at $11.02 per pound. And lithium is slightly lower at $10.03 per kilogram. That is 2 cents lower than last week and a new low since we started noting prices about 8 months ago when it was at $51.54, so now at $10.03. Uranium is trading at $81.05 per pound. That is $2 lower than last week. And zinc is higher at $1.43 per pound. That is 4 cents higher than last week. So gold, zinc, and palladium all doing quite well there. And the other metals really kind of drifting sideways, some higher, some lower. Nothing too dramatic, and those are your metal prices. Coming up, I'm very pleased to welcome for the first time to the Northern Miner podcast, Jennifer Cameron, Vice Chair of Women in Mining Canada, and we have a great discussion on the latest initiatives to increase the number of women in the mining industry, what could be done more, what are some of the stumbling blocks, and much more. A fascinating discussion with Jennifer Cameron. I hope you enjoy it. And I will see you on the other side. Joining us today, I'm very pleased to welcome for the first time to the Northern Miner podcast, Jennifer Cameron, Vice Chair of Women in Mining Canada. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's a delight to have you here, Jennifer. What an interesting time it must be for women in mining. So I guess to get us started here, big picture, like how are women in mining doing?
I think looking at where we are today, certainly there's a lot of talk about, the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion, the role of women within the industry. There's a lot of we've come so far kind of dialogue. And I would agree with that at a fundamental point. I think it is becoming increasingly clear that diversity and gender diversity is important for the future of the industry and that women have a lot to offer overall. But at the end of the day, there's still a lot of work to do. And the way that I look at it is as companies focus on things like culture and increasing representation, there's still fundamental things that need to be addressed when we think about women in the industry. For example, does every woman working on a mine site have the proper equipment these days? If the answer is no or not certain, then that is a fundamental thing that we need to be addressing. And so that tends to be how I personally look at it is, there's the culture shift that's happening and the conversations and the dialogue, but, what is the reality for women working on mine sites who are in fly out camps, who are working in production roles? There's certain places around the world where women can't even work underground, whereas other people tend to focus more on the culture shift that's happening. And so it's a bit of a tale of two cities in certain respects.
Very interesting. So, and I love how you put it, like the reality, on the ground versus the discussion, which is kind of a interesting, it's easy to have the discussion, and the discussion is often, for better or for worse, probably for worse, politicized in a sense with the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion dialogue. But I love how you are kind of, in a sense, focused, it seems to me, on the reality on the ground for women, say safety equipment and whatnot. So in the spirit of the reality, like, do you have any idea on the numbers as far as like how many women versus men? Let's talk about representation. Like, what is your sense of how the numbers line up between, say, women and men in the mining industry? And pick any jurisdiction you want or globally, if that works too.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, it is still quite small. I would put it probably around 20-25% are women, and it gets a lot smaller when you look further up the food chain. So women in entry-level positions tends to be a lot higher representation. But as you get higher and higher towards the senior levels, so management, board of directors, it becomes increasingly smaller. And so what that tells me is, at the moment, we're doing an okay job at attracting women into the industry. We have trouble keeping them here. And that is really what I think the challenge is for companies looking out in the future is how do we fix that? What is it about the mining industry that makes it more difficult to retain female talent?
It's interesting. I mean, and do you have an answer for that question, or at least some speculation? Like, do you think it's a cultural issue within an industry that traditionally is seen as fairly conservative? And I don't mean that in a political sense, but just in a sense that it's a slow to change kind of industry. We think of that in terms of technology. Like, what would you attribute that to, if you have any ideas on that, as to why it is hard to retain women in the mining industry?
I think it's a couple of different things. One, it's lack of opportunity or the lack of perception of opportunity. And so that could just come down to not seeing the career growth that women are looking for, within the first, several years of their career. And so they step out to try different areas. Part of it is also mentorship. And so having those champions within the management teams to champion women or to mentor them to help them develop and grow. And then I think there could just be a factor of reality of, life as a working woman in terms of career choices, family planning versus what type of work you're going to be doing. I think a lot of people will look at something like a rotational or a fly in, fly out position and wonder, how could I possibly have a family if I'm going to be away for, those extended periods of time and not quite having the family structure set up to support that. So there's a little bit of a mix of things, but that tends to be what I look at. And then certainly when you get into the management pieces, if your talent pool is getting smaller and smaller, the longer women are in the industry, you're losing those senior managers, those directors, and therefore that's the talent pool that you want to elevate to those senior management positions, to the board of directors. And, I think that there has been a lot of focus from a governance perspective from investors for looking into the companies that they're investing in and pushing for better gender representation at the board and management level. And we have certainly seen a shift in that where there are a lot more gender balanced boards out there, but it's taken time. And one thing that tends to happen is you'll have the same women on a number of different boards. And so that doesn't necessarily increase the diversity when it's the same people over and over again. You're falling into that same trap.
And you do hear about that, how investors, there is a sense that it's more important than ever
Mhm.
to have women on the board. And I think there's even research, if I recall from a previous interview, that generally those boards with more gender equity, shall we call it, do tend to perform better. Have you heard anything like that before?
Yeah, I've definitely seen research, and I wouldn't say it's not just the board of directors. You see it at all, a lot of different teams. If it's more diverse, if it's gender balanced, they tend to perform better just in terms of diversity of thought, different thinking. There's even, the very basic story about, female haul truck drivers tend to have much better utilization rates. Equipment doesn't break down as quickly. They're much more productive because of those reasons. They take better care of the equipment. And so I think across the board, there is data that indicates that, at the end of the day, it's better for all aspects of a company to have more diversity within their teams.
And just a final question on the representation side of things. Like, do you tend to find that women, like, do they represent in higher ratios, shall we say, in the higher parts of the organization? I think that would be the assumption, is that maybe they're more in the office sort of area rather than, I don't know, working underground. But is that a myth? Do you see a disparity, shall we say, in different parts of the organization of where women tend to end up?
I mean, I think certainly the perception is that women tend to be in, finance roles, more administrative positions. But again, I don't have the data easily at hand, but I would challenge that. I mean, personally, I work for a company where we're a bit of a unicorn. We have a significantly higher proportion of women in all roles, both at, junior levels, senior levels, across the board. And, there's certain companies like Major Drilling just recently announced their first all female drilling team, which I think is a significant accomplishment and what we need to be highlighting as an industry. When it comes to representation, you can only really think of yourself in a role that maybe you see someone who looks and thinks like you in that same position. And so, seeing women in these roles, highlighting them, promoting it, I think overall as an industry is something that we really need to focus on to show people, this is what mining looks like. It's not what you think. And there's a lot of women here, and this is what our reality is. This is why there's so much potential and opportunity within the work that we're doing.
Okay, excellent. So it does sound like there's improvement. I mean, would you say, in a sense, this kind of move towards DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just a general push to make things more equitable in the last few years, like it sounds like it's working on some levels. Like, how do you respond to that?
I definitely see progress. And at the end of the day, what's important is that people are focusing on it and that there are really good intentions, within the leadership of mining companies to move things forward, to make cultural changes. But at the same time, that needs to filter down. The people on the ground, whatever level within the organization, needs to have that same sense of importance around diversity and inclusion. And it starts with, good practices, good policies, and then at the end of the day, good leadership at all levels to really make sure that women feel valued, they feel comfortable, and that they understand, the great opportunities that can exist within the mining industry for their careers.
And how would you respond to people that are basically saying, ESG is dead to a certain degree? There's a article in the FT. The title finished "Long Live ESG," but there is a sense of fatigue. I think there's pushback you're going to find. It may not be stated publicly,
Mhm.
but I think we could both suspect that there's, going to be pushback of a certain kind that, this is being pushed, so to speak. How do you respond to that? What do you think of that?
I think that's just bad marketing. At the end of the day, when it comes to, certain aspects of ESG, looking at the companies who perform the best, whether you're from an investment standpoint or just meeting their production targets, safety, they're the ones who are focusing and who have really good performance on ESG metrics. And so making that clear to people, highlighting that. And at the end of the day, it's all about risk management. People tend to look at when it comes to the diversity and equity and inclusion conversation, I think there is growing fatigue around it. But part of that is, again, it tends to be couched in pretty nebulous terms or, kind of management consulting jargon that people lose the practical realities of it. And I think from that perspective, we really need to make sure that we're marketing it properly, using practical terms, putting it in practical circumstances so that people really understand what it is people are talking about, because otherwise you're just going to lose them. And you just bring it down to a basic, simple, personal level. I think that is really where it can resonate and make the kind of change that people are looking for.
Okay, very interesting. And, speaking of the personal, I mean, I assume Women in Mining has meetings. What kind of messages do you hear from individuals? Like, what are people saying kind of that needs to happen or that are issues? Like, what kind of things are you hearing?
One is definitely around mentorship. Women are looking for whether it's other women or it's other leaders within the industry to step up and help them develop in terms of giving them the right advice, opening the door for opportunity, ensuring that there's no barriers to it. And I think that is really one of the bigger areas of opportunity. We're also looking at things like, I mentioned earlier, safety equipment, does it fit? Are the right systems in place? And so we're potentially looking at possibly having conversations around exploring biases in safety systems, in policies to understand that better. So trying to bring it down to, the language that everyone understands. And in the mining industry, safety always comes first. And so if we can attack that, then we can really highlight what's important and what is at stake when we ignore the importance of gender diversity.
Indeed. And so, on the subject of mentorship, when people attend your meeting, are there many young people, say, that attend your meetings? There is a sense in the industry that not enough new talent is coming up. I mean, what are you seeing on your side?
I think there is a lot of great young women entering the industry. I really am excited for what they're going to bring for us. So, Women in Mining Canada, annually we have our Mining Trailblazer Award series. It focuses on a couple things. So, looking at who are the women in the industry who are making great change. Part of that, working with some of our sponsors, we also offer two scholarships. And every year it's really hard to judge who wins that because the quality of the talent that's out there is so high. And, really, I think there's a lot of really strong interest from other companies to ensure that we're developing that because that, at the end of the day, is the future of the industry. We are facing a talent gap, and we have for many years. There's, a study that I read recently, there's something like 42% of young people would never consider a future in the mining industry. And that, to me, is almost catastrophic when it comes to attracting the right level of people. And so we really need to focus on that and highlight the success stories so that people understand the opportunities that are here and who and what mining really looks like.
Okay, so you have some award nominations then. So tell us about like when is this? Are these nominations for scholarships or is that something separate? Tell us kind of what you're doing in a sense to celebrate merit and, people developing in this industry.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So, Women in Mining Canada annually hosts the Trailblazer Awards. There are 5 awards. It's Canada's largest award program celebrating women in mining. So, there is a Trailblazer Award recognizing women making a difference for other women in the industry. And there's also the Indigenous Trailblazer Award. We also have a Mentorship Award named in honor of Rick Hudson, which focuses on, people who are mentoring either students or other women in the industry. And it's the only award that a man is also invited to be nominated for. And then we have the 2 Student Trailblazer Awards. And along with that, there's a $5,000 scholarship for each winner that is sponsored by some generous companies. Nominations are currently open. They close on December 6th. And then the award ceremony is held every year during the PDAC, which is at an event we call Mining for Diversity. And it is a great event. Last year was fantastic. It was one of the largest we'd had. And it's really just a great portion of the PDAC where we can celebrate women, focus on the positive, and demonstrate what success can look like for women in the industry. And then along with that, we also host a bunch of different events. We'll be doing a full day of programming, again, focusing on different topics related to diversity, but also just focused on how can we help women in mining develop. So perhaps some speed networking and other seminars and courses. So stay tuned for that programming announcement during the PDAC. And then a lot of our work, we focus on, again, other opportunities to provide scholarships for students. We have a pretty good network of partners that we're working with right now. And so looking at, for example, last year is the first year we partnered with the Canadian Mining Games, which helped provide additional scholarships for women who participated. We do some webinars. We had a great one last week with a number of engineering consultants talking about 43101 and the difference between some of the technical studies. So again, highlighting women, showing women being excellent in what they do without necessarily focusing on the diversity aspect of it, but just elevating them and providing them the platform to share their knowledge and hopefully help other women learn something through that process.
Very interesting. And as far as the mentorship issue, I mean, do you suspect like part of the reason is because the mining industry is already higher numbers of males and maybe the genders tend to gravitate towards mentoring their own gender? Like, is that kind of the dynamic that's at work there? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a tough one because I do think that, men can be fabulous mentors to women. I personally have had some great male mentors within my career. I think mentorship overall, and I wouldn't even say it's necessarily particularly acute when it comes to women, but young people or people earlier in their career, regardless of gender, are looking for that mentorship role because, again, it can really be so valuable at any point in your career to have that guidance, to have opportunities and doors open to you. And so I wouldn't necessarily couch it as necessarily a gender issue, but certainly there is a level of bias that can happen. Like you tend to gravitate towards people who are like you, who remind you of yourself when you're thinking of who you can help develop. Part of that's natural. And so really focusing on what are those unconscious biases and how you can make sure that you're recognizing, the overall pool of talent. And part of it again is also there tends to be a certain path when it comes to, moving through your career in the mining industry. You work in a production role, you become a manager, you become a supervisor, maybe you're a GM one day. Like there's a certain career path that people are used to following. that sometimes you can bring in someone from outside of that and train them very quickly if they have the right skills, they have the passion and the knowledge and the drive to really learn all of that. But we tend to be, going back to what you said earlier about the industry being a bit conservative, sometimes we don't think outside the box when it comes to that level of talent and skill. And I think you marry those two things together. So looking outside of your own box and making sure that you're addressing your unconscious bias about who has the most potential, who has the right skills, I think can be, the remedy for some of that.
It really highlights the importance of the work you're doing. Are there any final thoughts you have on maybe what more you'd like to see in the industry, maybe initiatives that Women in Mining Canada is working on? Like, if you could kind of wave a magic wand in a sense, like, is there anything that you feel like if only this would change, then things would move quicker and faster and move in a positive direction in a more expedient way?
Certainly visibility. I would really like to see a lot more and hear a lot more from women and see the success stories that are out there, because I think that can be really inspirational and it provides, a clear path forward for a lot of people. And then, at the end of the day, it is the leadership. Again, I think corporate offices have done a great job of really opening up and having that conversation, but it's the boots on the ground. It's the lower level. It's middle management that really needs to be the target of that conversation. And, part of that I think is having more women in roles that just changes the conversation immediately. But, absent that, training, understanding, making it clear that, women have a role to play. We add a lot of value to what we do. And that is for the overall industry to be successful. We need to succeed in that.
Okay, excellent. And just one final follow-up question on that. I mean, do large mining companies ever reach out to you and, for any kind of, I don't know, consulting or anything like that, or just questions, or even to maybe highlight things that they want to let you know about that they're doing? What's the kind of relationship between, say, Women in Mining and the industry itself?
A lot of our dialogue has been focused with our sponsors, and currently we have over 30 sponsors from within the mining industry or mining adjacent fields. And through that, we've had some great conversations, just understanding, what those companies are doing themselves, what we see, how we can have a dialogue around that. And it's definitely, certainly over the past 3 or 4 years, that I've been involved with Women in Mining Canada, I've seen a pretty big shift and a really big increase in the desire for companies to continue that dialogue and to see how we can help them and how we can continue to highlight the work that's going on. And I think, hopefully one day as the organization continues to grow, we can continue that dialogue and make it bigger and more inclusive for all the other companies. I think the real opportunity that's out there is there's a lot of big companies involved, but what about the smaller junior companies? They're probably, smaller companies don't have as many resources. They're looking for the right path forward, to start off on the right foot. And so how can Women in Mining Canada help support them? That's a conversation that we have at the board level all the time.
Jennifer Cameron, Vice Chair of Women in Mining Canada, thank you for joining us and sharing your insights on this week's Northern Miner podcast.
Thank you so much.
And once again, a big thank you to Jennifer Cameron of Women in Mining Canada for joining us on this week's episode of the Northern Miner Podcast. And thank you, dear listener, for joining us once again and supporting this show. If you want to help out the podcast, please leave us a review in the Apple Podcast directory, share it with your friends, and until next week, take care.